So once our web vertical component is created, we could continue and we could write an automated API test. So why do we need actually this API test? Well, this will guarantee that our component will work consistently according to its specification, because we could not guarantee that we will test each and every time correctly when we use a manual testing using an API client. But we could enforce it using an API test. So let's go and let's start coding, and without further ado, let's go and let's create inside the test package a new package that will called a web, because here we will allocate components for the web layer. So I would like to create a new Java class, and it will called a web vertical test. So the process of writing API tests for GraphQL endpoints is not different from writing an API test for HTTP REST API endpoints. There is some small differences, but as we use the same HTTP protocol under the hood, the difference would be very small, and I will point you on these things. So first thing first, of course, we need to remove this modifier, and let me just go to Zen mode in order to maximize my screen. So the first thing first, of course, we need to extend our test class with Vert.x extension, but also you need to remember that we need to have this Mockito extension, because what we have here, we need to mock a component. So which component do we need to mock? So it would be an employee service, and we need also to use inject mocks annotation in order to provide it to our web vertical. So also we need to have a variable that will contain a web client, because we will use it in order to send HTTP requests to our server. So let's create a web client, and remember that in Vert.x and Vert.x ecosystem we don't have a separate web test client like another framework such as Spring or Django, and we will use a normal web client in order to send requests. So the final thing for this section is to use this before each annotation in order to create a setup method. So here we have first a Vert.x argument and Vert.x test context. So what we actually need to do here, first thing first, we need to initialize a client, and we could do it by using this create static method. And the next, we need to actually deploy our vertical, because yes, it is initialized with the service as an argument. However, we need to deploy it, because without deploying, the server will not actually run. So what we say next, we say Vert.x deploy vertical, and we pass a vertical, and then we specify on failure handler, and in this case we will fail a context, and we say on success, and in this case we say context complete now. So now we have set up our test, and let's start by creating actually test methods. Okay, let's start with our first API test, and in this first API test we will verify the behavior of CreateEmployee method. So without further ado, let's create a new test method, and let's name it CreateEmployee test. So as always, we pass here two arguments, will be Vert.x and a Vert.x test context. So next thing we need to do, and actually the first thing that we need to do, we need to specify a Mockito behavior. But first thing first, we need to prepare an employee instance. So let's create it. And here we will provide a random ID by using this random UID method. We will provide here a first name, which will be John, and the last name would be Do, which is a pretty obvious choice for this kind of testing. So next, let's specify a Mockito behavior. So we say Mockito when. So when the service CreateEmployee method would be called with any Mockito, any employee instance. So as we just create a new employee, and once we create it from the request, we will return, and don't forget that we need to actually return in future. So we say future. Succeeded future, and we will wrap this employee as a value here. So next, what we need to do, we need actually to prepare a query. I have already prepared it, and as you see, we have here a first name and a last name. And actually, as you could see, this is the reason why we use here a Mockito any, because we actually don't have this employee instance. So the employee instance that would be passed as an argument for this method, which is not equal to this employer instance, because we will create it inside the web vertical. And for this, we could not use this we couldn't use a specification when we pass here CreateEmployee and passing here employee instead of this behavior. So next thing, we need to prepare a JSON object which will be a body, because actually what we have here is a standard HTTP post request. So in this case, we create a new JSON object and we create here an only one field which will be called query, and we pass here this query. Next, as always, we use a context verify block in order to verify asynchronous behavior. And what we have here, we say here client post apps, because we actually have here an absolute URI, and we say HTTP localhost 8080, and we pass here a GraphQL. And then what we need to do here, we need to send a JSON object which will be this body, and we specify on failure behavior, and we say here context fail now, and we specify on success behavior. So on success behavior would be a bit larger than on failure behavior. What we need to get here, first I would like to have a body of the response as a string. So let's create a new variable which we call result, and as a response body as string. So the next thing, I would like to have a separate variable for ID. So it's a string ID, and we say employee ID and to string, and then I will run an assertion, and I have here a standard JUnit5 assertions. So assert equals, and in order to do assertions, we will use a standard string method that is called contains. So we want to check that result actually will contain this ID. And finally, actually we need to have here assert true, which was my mistake. And once assertions would be passed, we'll call context complete now in order to finish this asynchronous operation. So what we will do now, we will run this test. So as you see, this test passed, and we could continue with another methods. So the next API test that we need to write here is an UpdateEmployee test, which will be actually the same as a CreateEmployee, but the query would be a little bit different. So let's start encoding. So let's create a new test method, and let's call it UpdateEmployee test. So we have here vertx and a context arguments. So as we did in the previous case, we prepare an employee instance. Likewise we did, so we have here in random UUID value as ID. First name would be John, and the last name would be Dom. So next we specify a Mockito behavior. So when service UpdateEmployee methods would be called with any Mockito employee class, we will return a future, because this is an asynchronous result. So we have here this employee value, and then we pass here a query. So as you could see, what we have here this string format method, because we will need to substitute this employee ID value, as you could see here, because as you remember, in this mutation we need to specify not only first name and a last name, but we also need to specify an ID, because we need to update a certain employee. So the next thing, we create a JSON object for body, and here we put this value. And now what we could do, we could use this context verify block in order to verify an asynchronous behavior of this method. So what we have here, we say the same client post apps, and as you could note that all requests when we talk about GraphQL, they all are sent to the same API endpoint. So in another case would be a localhost GraphQL. So say HTTP localhost 8080 GraphQL. So all requests are sent to the same endpoint. So this is a difference between GraphQL and the REST API specifications, because in REST API we have several endpoints for each and every action, but in a GraphQL we have the same endpoint and we specify our operations using mutations and queries definitions. So next we send this JSON object and we send this body and we specify on failure handler and we specify on success handler. So the assertion logic for this on success would be the same as we did in the CreateEmployee method. So we just could copy and paste it. So now let's verify that this method works correctly by running this test. So let's run UpdateEmployee test. And as you could see, it was passed correctly. So let's continue with other test methods. So the next test method that we will specify here would be a RemoveEmployee test. And the difference between CreateEmployee and UpdateEmployee is that we don't actually have this employee instance, we just need to have an ID. So let's start coding. So let's create a new test method and let's call it RemoveEmployee test. So as I have said already, we don't need to have the full employee instance like we did before. What we need to do, we need to have an ID. So let's say UID, and we have here UID, random UID. So next, what we need to do, so Makito when, and we specify here service RemoveEmployee behavior. So here we pass here an ID. And then all we need to do is just to return a succeeded future without any value. So next, we need to prepare a query. So as you could see, this query has this is a mutation that has one argument, which will be this ID that we have here. So it will be pretty simple. And a response of this operation will be either true or false. So once we pass here a succeeded future as a response, of course, the result will be true, and this is what we need to verify. So, but first thing first, let's prepare a JSON object with a body. So, let's create this JSON object, and let's put here a query. And let's put here a query. The next thing, we need to prepare a context verify block. And here, what we'll do here, we specify client post apps methods, and as always, we will use the same endpoint for all our tests here. So this is the difference between GraphQL and REST API specifications. And send JSON object here, because the idea here is that we still use the same HTTP post methods under the hood. So we don't have here the put methods, or we don't have here delete methods, or here we have post methods. For all our tests, including for queries, what we will have the same HTTP post methods with a JSON body. So this is a kind of how GraphQL works, and you could check it in the previous episodes of this series. So let's send the JSON object and specify on failure behavior. And now let's specify an on success behavior, because here we'll have an assertions logic. So what we need to get here, so let's get a body as string. And next, let's create an assertions. And we have here result contains true, because the true value, a boolean value, this true value would be returned as a result of successful deletion operation. So that's what we need to check. And finally, we say context complete. Now let's run this test to verify that it works as expected. So now we have it and it works perfectly. So before we'll continue with find all employees test methods, let's just go back to this employee service interface and let's just recap the specification of this method. So as you could see here, what we need to return here, we need to return this specific class that is called EmployeeList. And let's, if we go to its definition, to this EmployeeList class, what you could see here, that is basically wrap a list of employees. So it's a record that has the only one field of this list. So without further ado, let's go and let's actually start coding this test methods. So what I'd like to do first, I'd like to go to the Zen mode. So let's create a new test method that will call find all employees test, and here we have a vertex argument and a vertex test context argument. So first thing first is we need to have here some amount of mock data, because we actually have a find all employees and we need to have several instances. So I have already prepared it, so let's just paste them. And the next thing, we need to prepare a Mockito behavior. So let's say Mockito when service find all employees, and this method doesn't have any arguments. And in this case, we will return, and don't forget that we need to return a future succeeded future with this employees list. So now we need to prepare a query, and in this case we need to have a query that we specified in our GraphQL specification. So it will be very easy. We don't have any kind of arguments to pass. So we have here a string called query, and what I like here is two curly braces. The name of a query would be all employees, and then we specify in another pair of curly braces, we need to specify which fields that we need to have for each and every instances. So let's have all fields. So we have here first name, last name, and ID. So now we have here this specification. And the next thing, we need to prepare a JSON object. So just to remind here that, of course, if we will use a REST API, we need to have a get method. But because we have a GraphQL here, all methods, including these queries, will execute a HTTP post request under the hood. So this is kind of difference between GraphQL and REST API. So it's the same way we need to have here this body that will specify a query. So let's put this, let's put here query. And now we could create a context verify block in order to verify an asynchronous behavior. So as always, we say client post apps, and you could know that we use the same endpoint over and over again. And here we send a JSON object, which be this body. We specify on failure handler, and now we specify on success handler, which will actually have also an assertion logic. So what we need to do here, first thing first, I'd like to have this, as we have here, we have here a body as string. But what I'd like to do now, I would like to actually have this response as a JSON object. And in order to do this with a vertex, what we need to do, we need to use actually what is called a body codec. So before we'll actually execute this send JSON object methods, we need to provide a body codec. So we say body codec JSON object. So what it does, it actually will return response in the form of JSON object. So if we go here, you see that this HTTP response now wraps a JSON object, because if we go up to, for example, RemoveEmployee test, you could check that here we have actually a buffer, but now we have a JSON object. So without further ado, let's get a data. So let's say JSON object data. Actually, we have here a response data. Let's call it here because we have data beforehand. So response body. So now we have the JSON object, and we need to get a JSON object that is called data. And now we have a JSON array which will be part of this data, and we call here items. As a result, actually we have here response data, get a JSON array, and we call here all employees, because this JSON array will be named the same way as the query that we have here. So now what we could verify, and what we should verify, we need to verify that this JSON array actually contains 10 items like we have here. So let's say assertions assert equals 10, and we have here items size. And now I say context complete now once assertions was passed. So don't forget a semicolon here, and let's now run this test. So this find all employees test methods actually executed correctly, and we have only one remaining method that actually will retrieve a single item. But as you remember always, we need to verify two possible outcomes: when the item is presented and when the item is not presented. So let's see how we could do it. So the first situation that we want to verify is what will happen if the employee that we want to retrieve does not exist. So let's create a new test method, and let's call it find employee by ID does not exist test. And let's provide a vertex argument and a test context arguments. So actually here we don't need to have an employee, but we need just to have an ID of employee that we want to retrieve, and let's generate it. So we say ID, and let's generate a random UID. Now let's specify a Mockito behavior. So as this method on a service layer will return an optional, we just need to specify an empty optional as an output of this method. So we say Mockito when, and here we say service find employee by ID, and we specify this ID, and then we need to return succeeded future, but it will wrap an empty optional. So we say optional empty. So the next thing that we need to do, we need to prepare a query. So as you see, the query will use this employee query that is already predefined in our GraphQL specification. And now we need to go and create a new JSON object with this body. So then we put here a value, and we pass here query. And now we could use this context verify block in order to verify behavior of our code. So as always, we say client post apps, and we use the same endpoint over and over again, because this is kind of how GraphQL does work. So next we need to specify a body codec as we did it in the previous methods. So we specify here as, and say body codec JSON object, and then we send a JSON object, which will be this body. And we specify on failure behavior, and we specify on success block when we also specify an assertion logic. So what we need to do here, first thing first, we need to get this result JSON object. So we say JSON object result, and we have here response body get JSON object, and remember this JSON object is called data. So likewise we did it here. So next thing we need to do, we need to actually retrieve an item. So we say JSON object item, and now we say result get JSON object, and this JSON object is called the same way as actually our query is called. So in this case it will call employee, and we need to check that it's actually null because we don't have any item specified. We have here an empty optional. So we say assertions assert null, and we pass here this item, and finally we say context complete now in order to finish this asynchronous test. So let's now run this test. So this test is passed, but here we have a situation when employee does not exist, and let's now check how to verify when this employee does actually exist in our database. Okay, the last thing that we need to do, we need to verify this find employee by ID, but with actually employer item. So let's see how we could do it. So let's create a new test method, and let's call it find employee by ID does exist test. And we provide a vertex and a test context arguments. So the first thing first, here we need to prepare an employee. So let's create a mock employer. So let's give it an ID, a name, and a last name. And then what we need to do, we need to specify Mockito behavior. And here, when we call this find employee by ID, we specify here employer ID, and then we return the future with an optional value, and in this case we use this optional of in order to pass this employee. So now we could prepare a query. So for this query we use this ID, which comes from this employee ID, and now we need to prepare a JSON object for body. And here what we're gonna do, we will put this query, and now we could run this context verify block in order to assert asynchronous code. So we use this client post apps as we did previously, and we use the same endpoint for GraphQL queries, and we also need to provide a body codec because we want to make it as a JSON object. Then we send a JSON object with this body. We provide on failure handler, which will be pretty easy, and we provide on success handler, where what we would do, we will do assertion logic. So let's see what we need to do. First thing first, we need to get this JSON object result. So say response body get JSON object data, because as you remember we have this data object, as we did it in previous episodes of this series. We have this data, a JSON object which we need to retrieve, and from this data object we could assert actual data that is supplied by the query. So let's get an item, and you see that it's called the same way as the query. So the first assertion, we need to verify that it's not null, and then what we do, we will provide assertions to verify fields. So we have two fields, first name and a last name. So let's verify it. So the assertions, assert equals, and expected value would be employee, a first name, and here, because item is a JSON object, we could use this getString in order to verify actually this by key. So we have getString, of course, not integer, and here we pass first name, so the way we call this field here, and we have an assertions for the last name. So say employee last name, and say item getString last name, and finally we call context complete now. So this method is completed, and let's run it. So this test method is also executed correctly. So this is how we could actually verify find employee by ID in both of these situations.